At 62, I thought I'd seen every way a child could break their mother's heart. I was wrong. The email arrived on an ordinary Tuesday morning, polite and cold as winter. Dear Mom, we think it would be better if you watched the wedding via live stream instead. 40 years of sacrifice, $40,000 promised for her perfect day, and my own daughter had just uninvited me from the most important moment of her life. But what happened next? Well, she never saw that coming.
This is my story. My name is Helen Ramirez, and I'm about to tell you how one devastating email changed everything. How I went from being the family's invisible safety net to finally choosing myself. It's a story about what happens when a mother stops saying yes to everything and starts saying yes to her own life. So let me take you back to that Tuesday morning when everything fell apart and how it became the day I finally found myself again.
Chapter 1. The Email That Changed Everything. The morning light filtered through the lace curtains of Helen Ramirez's small kitchen, casting delicate shadows across the worn Formica countertop where her laptop sat open. At 62, Helen had grown to appreciate these quiet morning moments. The way the desert sun painted everything golden, the gentle hum of her old refrigerator, the ritual of her first cup of coffee, brewed strong and black, just the way her late husband Miguel used to like it. She had been scrolling through her usual morning routine, checking the weather, reading a few news headlines, and smiling at the photos her neighbor Mrs. Chen shared of her grandchildren. Her fingers, weathered from decades of caring for others, moved slowly across the trackpad. Technology still felt foreign to her sometimes, though her daughters had insisted she learn to use email and video calls to stay connected. That's when she saw it. The subject line that would change everything. Wedding update. Please read. Helen's heart fluttered with excitement. Sophia's wedding was just 6 weeks away, and Helen had been looking forward to it with the kind of anticipation that comes from watching your child achieve something beautiful. Her eldest daughter was marrying David, a successful architect from Denver, and the ceremony would be held at an elegant resort in Santa Fe. Helen had already picked out her dress, a deep navy blue with small pearl buttons that made her feel elegant without overshadowing the bride. She clicked on the email expecting details about the reception seating or perhaps a request to arrive early for family photos. Instead, she found words that seemed to blur before her eyes, as if her reading glasses had suddenly stopped working. Dear Mom, it began, formal in a way that made Helen's chest tighten. Sophia never called her mom in writing. It was always Mama or Mami, the affectionate names that had carried them through scraped knees and heartbreaks and late-night study sessions. She hoped you're doing well. I've been thinking a lot about the wedding, and David and I have decided we want to keep it very small and intimate. I know how much you've been looking forward to being there, but we think it would be better if you watched via live stream instead. I'll send you the link closer to the date. The ceremony is going to be quite formal, and we're worried about logistics with travel and accommodations. This way, you can be part of our special day without any of the stress or expense of traveling to Santa Fe. Helen read the paragraph 3 times before the words began to make sense. Then she read it again, searching for some hidden meaning, some explanation that would make this feel less like a slap across the face. I know this might be disappointing, but I hope you understand. We want everything to be perfect, and this seems like the best solution for everyone involved. Please let me know that you received this. Love, Sophia. The coffee cup trembled in Helen's hands as she set it down. She stared at the screen, waiting for the words to rearrange themselves into something that made sense, something that didn't feel like being erased from her own daughter's most important day. 56 years of motherhood flashed through her mind in rapid succession. Sophia as a colicky baby who would only sleep when Helen walked the floor with her for hours. Sophia at 7, refusing to let anyone else braid her hair for school picture day. Sophia at 16, sobbing in Helen's arms after her first heartbreak, begging her mother to make the pain go away. Sophia at 22, calling from college every Sunday evening just to hear her mother's voice. When had that Sophia disappeared? When had she been replaced by this stranger who wrote emails like business correspondence and spoke of her mother's presence as a logistical problem to be solved? Her hands moved to the keyboard, fingers hovering over the keys as she tried to find words for what she was feeling. She wanted to write about the 3 jobs she'd worked when Sophia was in high school: the night shifts at the hospital, the weekend cleaning service, the early morning cashier position at the grocery store, all so Sophia could take violin lessons and attend the summer debate camp that cost more than Helen made in a month. She wanted to write about the car she'd driven for 15 years, held together with prayer and determination, because every spare dollar went toward Sophia's college fund. She wanted to write about the countless times she'd said no to her own needs: new clothes, dental work, a weekend getaway with friends, because Sophia needed something more. But instead, Helen found herself closing the laptop with a soft click. The kitchen fell silent except for the ticking of the wall clock, a wedding gift from 40 years ago, one of the few things she'd kept after Miguel passed. She sat there in the growing morning light, feeling something shift inside her chest. It wasn't quite anger, not yet. It was something cooler, more deliberate. For 40 years, Helen had been the family's anchor, the one who sacrificed so others could soar. She had told herself it was love, that this is what mothers did. But sitting in her quiet kitchen, reading her daughter's polite dismissal, she began to wonder if love was supposed to make you disappear.
The email notification sound chimed again. Another message from Sophia. "Mom, did you get my email? Please respond so I know you saw it." Helen looked at the screen, then at her reflection in the black coffee. For the first time in decades, she had no immediate urge to fix, to soothe, to make everything better for everyone else. She poured the rest of her coffee down the drain and walked away from the computer, leaving Sophia's question unanswered. Outside, the New Mexico sun climbed higher, burning off the morning coolness and promising another day of desert heat. Something had changed in those few minutes between opening and closing her laptop. Helen couldn't name it yet, but she could feel it. A tiny seed of something that felt suspiciously like her own voice, buried under decades of being needed by everyone except herself. Chapter 2. Memories of Sacrifice. The afternoon heat made Helen's small house feel like an oven, but she didn't turn on the air conditioning. Old habits died hard, and after 40 years of watching every penny, the electric bill still mattered more than her comfort. Instead, she sat in her bedroom with the curtains drawn, letting the familiar dimness wrap around her like a blanket as memories began to surface. Memories she usually kept locked away because they hurt too much to examine. The dresser mirror reflected her face, lined now with years of worry and sleepless nights, but for a moment she saw herself at 35, bone-tired and hollow-eyed, coming home from another double shift at St. Vincent's Hospital. Miguel had been gone 3 years by then, taken by a heart attack that gave no warning, no time for goodbyes. The life insurance had barely covered the funeral costs, leaving Helen with 2 young daughters, a mortgage, and a determination that bordered on desperation. She remembered how her feet used to ache in those white nursing shoes, the kind that were supposed to provide support, but never quite did. 12 hours on the cardiac unit during the day, then straight to the emergency room for another 8-hour shift. The other nurses called her crazy, said she'd burn out within a month. But they didn't understand. Sophia needed new school clothes, and Marissa's glasses were held together with tape. The memory was so vivid she could smell the antiseptic, hear the constant beeping of monitors, feel the weight of exhaustion that settled into her bones like sediment. She would get home at 6 in the morning,
shower quickly, and then drive both girls to school before collapsing into bed for 4 hours of restless sleep. "Mama, why are your hands always so cold?" Marissa had asked one morning, her small fingers tracing the veins on Helen's wrist. Helen hadn't known how to explain that working nights made your body forget how to regulate temperature, that her hands were cold because her heart was so tired it barely had energy to pump blood to her extremities. The closet door was slightly ajar, and Helen could see the corner of an old shoebox on the top shelf. Inside were paycheck stubs from those years, thin slips of paper that told the story of a woman stretching herself beyond human limits. She had kept every one, maybe as proof that she had tried, that she had given everything she had. There was the stub from the week Sophia turned 16. Helen had worked 96 hours that week, regular shifts at the hospital, plus weekend cleaning at the office complex downtown, plus 3 nights stocking shelves at the grocery store. Sophia had wanted a car for her birthday, not a fancy one, just something reliable to get to her after-school job at the library. Helen had managed to scrape together $800 for a dented Honda Civic that leaked oil and had a radio that only played AM stations. "It's perfect, Mama," Sophia had whispered, throwing her arms around Helen's neck. "Thank you for everything." When was the last time Sophia had thanked her for anything? Helen pulled the shoebox down and opened it, her fingers trembling slightly as she sorted through the yellowed papers. Here was evidence of the Christmas she'd worked 5 straight days, sleeping in the hospital break room between shifts so she could afford the chemistry set Sophia desperately wanted. Here was the record of overtime hours that paid for Marissa's dance recital costume, the one with all the sequins that had to be sewn on by hand. She found the hospital schedule from Sophia's senior year of high school, when college applications were due and the fees seemed insurmountable. Helen had volunteered for every holiday shift that year, Thanksgiving, Christmas Eve, New Year's Day. While other families gathered around dinner tables, Helen was adjusting IV drips and checking vital signs, all so Sophia could apply to the expensive private colleges that would give her the best opportunities. The irony wasn't lost on her now. She had missed so many family holidays to pay for Sophia's future, and now Sophia was making sure Helen would miss the most important celebration of all. Her hands found another memory tucked between paycheck stubs, a doctor's appointment reminder from 15 years ago. She remembered that day with painful clarity. She had been having chest pains for weeks, the kind that made her worry she was following Miguel's path to an early grave. But the appointment conflicted with Sophia's college orientation day, the day they would tour the campus and meet with financial aid advisors. Helen had canceled the doctor's appointment and driven 6 hours to Albuquerque instead, sitting in financial aid offices while her chest ached and her left arm tingled with warning signs she chose to ignore. They had worked out a payment plan that night. Helen would take on student loans to cover what Sophia's scholarships didn't pay for. She signed her name to debt that would follow her well into retirement, all while her heart sent signals she was too devoted to acknowledge. The chest pains turned out to be anxiety and exhaustion, not a heart attack. But Helen never rescheduled that appointment. There was always something more pressing: Marissa's wisdom tooth extraction, Sophia's textbook costs, the leak in the roof that couldn't wait another month. She closed the shoebox and held it against her chest, feeling the weight of all those years. Every sacrifice had seemed necessary at the time, even noble. She had told herself she was building something beautiful. 2 daughters who would have opportunities she never had, who would never know the fear of choosing between groceries and rent. But somewhere along the way, the gratitude had faded. The phone calls became less frequent, the visits shorter and more obligatory. Helen had become a convenience, a safety net that was expected to be there without ever being acknowledged. The house felt smaller now, filled with the ghosts of all those unpaid hours, all those moments when she had chosen her daughter's needs over her own basic health and happiness. She thought about the vacations she had never taken, the friendships she had let slip away because she was always too tired, too worried,
too busy being the mother everyone needed her to be. There had been opportunities over the years, chances to date again, to travel with the church group, to take the evening art classes at the community college that had always appealed to her. But there was always a reason to say no, always someone who needed her more than she needed herself. The afternoon shadows were growing longer, and Sophia's email felt like a weight in her chest. Not the sharp pain of betrayal she had felt that morning, but something colder and more resolved. Helen had spent decades making herself smaller so her daughters could be bigger. She had worked herself to exhaustion, postponed her dreams, and ignored her own needs, all in service of their happiness. And this was her reward: to be politely uninvited from the celebration of everything her sacrifices had made possible. Helen stood up slowly, her knees protesting after sitting so long. She walked to the kitchen window and looked out at her small garden where tomatoes grew in neat rows despite the desert heat. She had planted them herself, tended them with the same devotion she had given to everything else in her life. But for the first time, she wondered what might grow if she tended to herself with even half that dedication. The computer still waited on the kitchen counter, Sophia's second message still unanswered. Helen looked at it for a long moment, then walked past it to pour herself a glass of water. Some questions, she was beginning to realize, didn't deserve immediate answers.
Chapter 3: The Withdrawal. The next morning, Helen woke with unusual clarity. The kind of mental sharpness that comes after a sleepless night spent staring at the ceiling, watching shadows shift across the walls as your mind works through problems like a computer processing data. She had lain there for hours, not tossing or turning, just thinking with the methodical precision of someone who had finally found the courage to examine her life honestly. By 6 o'clock, she was dressed in her best navy slacks and the cream-colored blouse she usually saved for church. She applied lipstick, something she rarely bothered with anymore, and looked at herself in the bathroom mirror. The woman staring back looked different somehow, more present, as if she had stepped fully into her own skin for the first time in years. The drive to First National Bank took 12 minutes through the quiet residential streets of her neighborhood. Helen had banked there for 37 years, through home mortgages and car loans and the countless small financial crises that came with raising children alone. The building was low and adobe style, designed to blend with the southwestern architecture that tourists found so charming. She parked in the same spot she always used, under the cottonwood tree that provided shade for her aging Honda. Inside, the familiar smell of carpet cleaner and air conditioning greeted her. Maria Gonzalez was working the customer service desk, the same woman who had helped Helen refinance her house 10 years ago when the adjustable rate mortgage had nearly bankrupted her. "Mrs. Ramirez, how wonderful to see you. How are the wedding preparations going?" Maria's smile was genuine, warm, in the way that came from years of knowing someone's financial struggles and victories. Helen felt something twist in her stomach. Not guilt, exactly, but a recognition that this conversation would be more difficult than she had anticipated. "That's actually why I'm here, Maria. I need to cancel a transfer." Maria's fingers flew across her keyboard, pulling up Helen's accounts. "Of course, no problem at all. Which transfer would you like to cancel?" "The $40,000 wire to Sophia's account. It was scheduled for next Friday." The typing stopped. Maria looked up from her screen, eyebrows raised in surprise. "The wedding fund? Are you sure? That's quite a large amount." Helen had expected this reaction. $40,000 represented nearly 2 years of her Social Security payments, plus a significant chunk of her small retirement savings. It was money she had scraped together by selling Miguel's tools, cashing in a life insurance policy, and taking a second mortgage on the house. Money that represented decades of deferred gratification and careful planning.
I'm sure, Helen said, her voice steadier than she felt. I'd like to cancel it today. Maria's professional smile flickered slightly. Mrs. Ramirez, forgive me, but this is such a substantial amount. Are you having second thoughts about the expense, or is there a problem with the wedding? Sometimes families have disagreements, but they usually work things out. The suggestion that this was merely a family squabble, something that would blow over after hurt feelings were soothed, made something harden in her chest. She thought about Sophia's email, the casual way her daughter had erased her from the most important day of her life, reducing her to a live stream viewer as if she were a distant acquaintance. There's no disagreement, Helen said carefully. My circumstances have changed, and I'm no longer able to make this transfer. Maria's nod was slow, though her expression suggested she wasn't entirely convinced. I understand. Let me pull up the transfer details. More typing, then a long pause as Maria read something on her screen. I see this transfer was set up 3 months ago. You've already sent $25,000 in smaller amounts over the past year for various wedding expenses. Helen knew those numbers by heart. The engagement party deposit, $3,000. The dress and alterations, $4,500. The photographer's retainer, $2,000. The flowers for the rehearsal dinner, $800. Each transfer had come with a grateful phone call from Sophia, full of excitement about color schemes and menu tastings and how perfect everything was going to be. I'm aware of the previous transfers, Helen said. I only want to cancel the final one. The $40,000 was designated for the venue final payment and catering, according to the memo you included. Mrs. Ramirez, I've known you for many years. You've always been so careful with money, so thoughtful about your daughter's needs. Are you certain about this decision? For a moment, Helen wavered. Maria was right. She had always been thoughtful about her daughter's needs, sometimes to the point of martyrdom. The old Helen would have found a way to make this work, would have taken another loan or sold something else precious to ensure Sophia's perfect day remained perfect. But the old Helen had never been told she was too much of a burden to attend her own wedding day. I've never been more certain about anything, Helen heard herself say, and was surprised by the quiet strength in her own voice. Maria's fingers hesitated over the keyboard one more time. This will leave Sophia's account about $40,000 short of what she's expecting. Have you discussed this with her? That's not my concern anymore. The words came out more sharply than Helen had intended, but she didn't soften them. For 40 years, Sophia's concerns had been her concerns. Her problems had become her problems to solve. Her dreams had taken priority over her own basic needs. Not anymore. Maria completed the transfer with professional efficiency, though Helen could see questions in her eyes. The transfer has been canceled. The funds will remain in your savings account. Is there anything else I can help you with today? Actually, yes. Helen surprised herself again. I'd like to open a separate savings account. Something for me. Of course. What would you like to call it? Helen thought for a moment. All her accounts had always been practical. Household expenses, car maintenance, emergency fund. Never anything that was purely hers, purely for joy or spontaneity, or the kind of small luxury she had trained herself not to want. Helen's account, she said finally. It felt strange to say her own name that way, to claim space that wasn't defined by her relationship to someone else. As Maria filled out the paperwork, Helen found herself looking around the bank with new eyes. She noticed things she had never paid attention to before. The travel brochures near the teller windows, advertising trips to Europe and Hawaii. The investment pamphlets promising growth and security. The poster about financial planning that asked, "What are your retirement dreams?" For the first time in decades, Helen allowed herself to consider the question seriously. When the paperwork was complete, Helen walked back to her car with a lightness she hadn't felt since she was young. The $40,000 was still hers. The money she had planned to give away was now sitting in her account, earning interest, belonging to her alone. She sat in the driver's seat for several minutes, not starting the engine, just absorbing the magnitude of what she had done. In 30 minutes, she had taken control of her financial life in a way that felt revolutionary. No one had consulted her needs when Sophia planned this elaborate wedding. No one had asked if she could truly afford to give away such a significant portion of her security. They had simply expected it, the way they had expected everything else from her over the years. Her phone buzzed with a text message. Sophia, of course. "Mom, please call me. We need to talk about the wedding." Helen looked at the message for a long moment, then put her phone back in her purse without responding. She started the car and pulled out of the parking lot, driving home through streets that somehow looked brighter, more full of possibility than they had that morning. For the first time in decades, Helen Ramirez was not rushing to solve someone else's crisis. She was not sacrificing her own stability for someone else's dreams. She was not making herself smaller so others could be bigger. She was simply driving home with $40,000 in her account and the strange, wonderful feeling of being in control of her own life.
Chapter 4. Confrontation with Marissa. Helen had barely finished watering her tomatoes when she heard the car door slam in her driveway. The sound was sharp and angry, the kind of car door slam that announced trouble before the person even reached the front door. Through her kitchen window, she could see Marissa striding up the walkway, her designer heels clicking against the concrete with staccato precision. At 28, Marissa had inherited Miguel's dark eyes and Helen's stubborn chin, but none of her mother's patience. She worked in marketing for a tech company in Albuquerque and wore her success like armor, expensive clothes, perfect makeup, and an air of barely controlled efficiency that made Helen sometimes wonder when her younger daughter had stopped laughing. The doorbell rang once, twice. Then Marissa was pounding on the door. "Mom, I know you're in there. We need to talk, now." Helen dried her hands on a dish towel and walked slowly to the front door. She could see Marissa through the glass panel, pacing in small circles, her phone pressed to her ear. "No, Sophia, she's not answering. I don't know what's gotten into her." A pause. "Yes, I'll handle it." Helen opened the door just as Marissa was raising her fist to pound again. "There you are." Marissa pushed past her mother into the living room without invitation. "What the hell is going on? Sophia called me crying saying you canceled the wedding money. Please tell me that's not true." Helen closed the door carefully and turned to face her daughter. Marissa was standing in the middle of the living room like a tornado gathering strength, her hands on her hips, her carefully styled hair slightly disheveled from the drive. "It's true," Helen said simply. "Are you insane?" The words came out like a slap. "Do you have any idea what you've done? The wedding is 6 weeks away. 6 weeks, Mom. The caterer needs to be paid. The venue needs their final payment. There are deposits that can't be refunded." Helen walked to her favorite armchair, the faded blue recliner that had been Miguel's, and sat down. The familiarity of the worn fabric beneath her hands was comforting. "I'm aware of the timeline." "Then why would you do this?" Marissa's voice cracked slightly. "This isn't like you. You don't just abandon people when they need you." The word abandon hung in the air between them like smoke. Helen felt something shift inside her chest, not the usual rush to apologize and fix everything, but a strange stillness. "Is that what I'm doing? Abandoning people?" "What else would you call it?" Marissa began pacing again, her heels leaving small indentations in Helen's old carpet. "Sophia planned this whole wedding around your contribution. She's been telling everyone about this beautiful ceremony in Santa Fe, and now she has to call them all and explain that her mother decided to ruin everything at the last minute." Helen studied her daughter's face, the flush of anger, the way her jaw clenched just like Miguel's used to do when he was frustrated. But underneath the anger, she could see something else. Fear, maybe.
or disappointment that the family's reliable safety net had suddenly developed holes. Tell me, Marissa, when was the last time Sophia called me just to see how I was doing? The pacing stopped. What does that have to do with anything? When was the last time either of you visited without needing something? Money, babysitting, help with a problem? Marissa's mouth opened, then closed. She could see her daughter mentally scrolling through recent conversations, recent visits, looking for evidence that would contradict what they both knew was true. "You're our mother," she said finally, as if that explained everything. "That's what mothers do. They help their children." "Yes," Helen said quietly. "That's what I've done for 40 years. I've helped, I've given, I've worked multiple jobs to pay for your education, your opportunities, your dreams. I've skipped vacations, postponed medical care, ignored my own needs to make sure you both had everything you wanted. And we're grateful." "Are you?" The question came out sharper than Helen intended. Because Sophia's way of showing gratitude was to uninvite me from her wedding, to ask me to watch my own daughter's most important day on a computer screen because my presence might create logistics issues. Marissa's face went pale. She didn't mean it like that. How did she mean it then? She's stressed. Planning a wedding is overwhelming. She probably just thought it would be easier. Easier for whom? Helen stood up, surprising herself with the steadiness of her voice. Easier for Sophia, certainly. Easier for David's family, who apparently find my presence somehow problematic. But easier for me? To be erased from the most important moment in my daughter's life? Marissa sank onto the couch, her corporate confidence deflating like a punctured balloon. "Mom, I'm sure if you just talk to her." "I've been talking to Sophia for 30 years. I've listened to every problem, solved every crisis, funded every dream. And the moment I needed her to see me as more than just a wallet and a safety net, she made it clear that I'm not welcome in her perfect day." The living room fell quiet except for the ticking of the wall clock. Helen could see Marissa processing this, perhaps for the first time considering the situation from her mother's perspective. "So you're going to punish her by ruining her wedding?" The question hit Helen like cold water. This was the crux of it, wasn't it? The assumption that a mother's worth was measured entirely by her willingness to sacrifice everything for her children's happiness, regardless of how they treated her in return. "I'm not punishing anyone," Helen said, settling back into her chair. "I'm simply no longer funding an event I'm not invited to attend." "But $40,000, Mom, do you know what that means? Sophia will have to cancel the venue. David's parents will think our family can't be trusted. The humiliation." "Whose humiliation?" Helen's voice was getting stronger with each word. "Mine, for being treated like a distant relative, or Sophia's for having to face the consequences of her choices?" Marissa's phone buzzed. She glanced at it, then looked back at her mother with something like desperation. "Sophia wants to know if you've changed your mind." "No." "Mom, please, think about what you're doing. This isn't just about the money. This is about family, about being there for each other when it matters." Helen almost laughed. "Being there for each other? Where was Sophia when I had pneumonia last winter and couldn't get out of bed for a week? Where were you when I fell in the garden and sprained my wrist? When was the last time either of you asked if I needed anything, wanted anything, dreamed of anything beyond being useful to you?" Marissa's mouth worked silently for a moment. Helen could see her daughter trying to find examples, trying to remember moments of genuine care that went beyond obligatory holiday calls and birthday cards. "We assumed you were fine. You never complain. You never ask for help." Because I learned long ago that my needs come last, that being a good mother meant disappearing so you could shine brighter. But I'm 62 years old, Marissa. I'm not going to live forever, and I'm tired of being invisible." Marissa stood up abruptly, her face flushed with a mixture of anger and something that might have been shame. "I can't believe you're doing this. I can't believe you're being so selfish." Selfish. The word that had haunted Helen for decades. The accusation that had kept her awake nights whenever she considered putting her own needs first. "Maybe I am being selfish," Helen said, and was surprised to find the word didn't sting anymore. "Maybe it's time." Marissa grabbed her purse and headed for the door. When Sophia's wedding is ruined, when she's crying on what should be the happiest day of her life, I hope you remember this conversation. She was halfway to the door when Helen's voice stopped her. "Marissa?" Her daughter turned, hope flickering in her eyes as if she expected Helen to cave, to apologize, to return to the familiar script of maternal sacrifice. "Your sister is a grown woman with a successful career and a wealthy fiancé. If she can't figure out how to pay for her own wedding without bankrupting her 62-year-old mother, maybe she's not ready to be married." The front door slammed hard enough to rattle the windows. Helen sat in the sudden silence of her living room, waiting for the familiar wave of guilt to wash over her, the crushing weight of maternal failure that had always accompanied any moment where she put her own needs first. It never came. Instead, she felt something she hadn't experienced in decades, the strange, liberating lightness of being exactly where she belonged, in her own house, in her own life, with her own money in her own account. For the first time in 40 years, Helen Ramirez was not chasing after someone else's crisis, not apologizing for having boundaries, not making herself smaller to make others comfortable.
She was simply sitting in her own chair, in her own house, watching the afternoon light slant through windows that belonged to her. And it felt like coming home to herself.
Chapter 5. The Pressure Mounts. The phone began ringing at 7 o'clock the next morning, jolting Helen from the first peaceful sleep she'd had in weeks. She lay in bed listening to the shrill sound echo through her small house, knowing without looking that it would be Sophia. When the answering machine finally picked up, her daughter's voice filled the quiet bedroom, high-pitched and strained with barely controlled panic. "Mom, it's me. Please pick up. I know you're there. We need to talk about this misunderstanding. Call me back as soon as you get this." The machine clicked off, and Helen pulled her pillow over her head. 5 minutes later, the phone rang again. By noon, there had been 14 calls. Helen sat at her kitchen table, watching the red light on her answering machine blink like a warning signal, listening to her daughter's voice evolve from confusion to irritation to something approaching desperation. "Mom, this is ridiculous. You can't just ignore me. Whatever I did to upset you, I'm sorry, okay? But you can't punish David and his family for something that's between us." Helen poured herself a cup of tea and opened yesterday's newspaper, spreading it carefully across the table. She had always been a methodical reader, starting with local news and working her way through national stories, obituaries, and finally the crossword puzzle. Today felt like a good day to maintain her routine. The phone rang again. Helen didn't even look up from the newspaper. "This is insane, Mom. Marissa told me what you said, and I think you're completely overreacting. You're making this about something it's not. I never said you weren't welcome. I said it might be easier if you watched online. There's a difference." Helen found herself reading the same paragraph 3 times, something about water rights and city council meetings. Sophia's voice continued in the background, each message growing longer and more frantic. "Look, Maybe I didn't explain it well in the email. David's parents are very particular about guest lists. They have this whole complicated family dynamic, and I was trying to avoid drama. But if it's that important to you, of course you can come. Just call me back so we can figure this out. The newspaper rustled as Helen turned the page. The obituary section was unusually long today. 3 people she recognized from church, all younger than she was. She paused to read about Mrs. Patterson, who had run the children's Sunday school for 30 years and died surrounded by her children and grandchildren. She lived for her family and found her greatest joy in their happiness. Helen wondered if Mrs. Patterson had ever felt invisible, if she had ever sat alone in her kitchen listening to messages from children who only called when they needed something. The phone rang again. Helen didn't even glance toward the kitchen. "This is insane, Mom. Marissa told me what you said, and I think you're completely overreacting. You're making this about something it's not. I never said you weren't welcome. I said it might be easier if you watched online. There's a difference." Helen found herself reading the same paragraph 3 times, something about water rights and city council meetings. Sophia's voice continued in the background, each message growing longer and more frantic. "Look, maybe I didn't explain it well in the email. David's parents are very particular about guest lists. They had this whole complicated family dynamic, and I was trying to avoid drama. But if it's that important to you, of course you can come. Just call me back so we can figure this out." The newspaper rustled as Helen turned the page. The obituary section was unusually long today. 3 people she recognized from church, all younger than she was. She paused to read about Mrs. Patterson, who had run the children's Sunday school for 30 years and died surrounded by her children and grandchildren. She lived for her family and found her greatest joy in their happiness. Helen wondered if Mrs. Patterson had ever felt invisible, if she had ever sat alone in her kitchen listening to messages from children who only called when they needed something. The phone rang again. Helen didn't even glance toward the kitchen. "This is insane, Mom. Marissa told me what you said, and I think you're completely overreacting. You're making this about something it's not. I never said you weren't welcome. I said it might be easier if you watched online. There's a difference." Helen found herself thinking about all the times her presence had been taken for granted, all the moments when she had been expected to be available without question. Sophia's high school graduation, where Helen had worked a double shift the night before and fallen asleep during the ceremony only to be scolded for not being present for such an important moment. Marissa's college orientation, where Helen had driven 8 hours to attend information sessions her daughter never thanked her for. The countless birthday parties, school plays, and soccer games where she was the photographer, the snack provider, the cleanup crew, essential but invisible. She remembered Sophia's college graduation, where Helen had sat in the blazing sun for 3 hours to watch her daughter walk across the stage for 30 seconds. Afterward, at the restaurant celebration, Sophia had spent the entire meal on her phone, coordinating plans with friends for the real party that Helen wasn't invited to. When Helen had mentioned feeling left out, Sophia had rolled her eyes and said, "Mom, you wouldn't want to come anyway. It's just a bunch of young people being loud." There had been Marissa's promotion celebration 2 years ago, where Helen had driven to Albuquerque with a homemade cake and a card, only to discover the party had been moved to an expensive restaurant she couldn't afford. She had ended up eating alone at a Denny's while her daughter posted Instagram photos of cocktails and laughter with her work friends. The pattern was always the same. Helen was expected to show up, to provide, to support, to celebrate from the periphery without ever being truly included, truly seen, truly valued as more than a supporting character in her daughter's stories. By evening, the answering machine was full. 27 messages from Sophia, 3 from Marissa, and 1 from a number Helen didn't recognize, probably David, finally being dragged into the family drama. Helen sat in her recliner as darkness fell, listening to the desert wind rattle her windows. The silence in her house felt different now, not empty but full of her own thoughts, full of space for her to exist without immediately filling it with worry about someone else.
Sophia's last message of the day was different from the others. Her voice was cold, controlled, the tone she used when she was truly angry. Fine, Mom. If this is how you want to play it, then I guess I know where I stand. I guess I know what I'm worth to you. When people ask me why my mother is not my wedding, I'll tell them the truth, that you chose money over your own daughter's happiness. I hope it's worth it. Helen felt something she hadn't expected. Relief. The manipulation was finally out in the open, the emotional blackmail laid bare. For decades, she had responded to this tone by apologizing, by giving in, by making herself smaller to avoid conflict. But now, sitting in her quiet living room with $40,000 in her bank account and her phone mercifully silent, Helen realized something profound. She didn't have to defend herself anymore. She didn't have to explain or justify or argue her worth to people who had already decided she was expendable. Sometimes the most powerful response was no response at all. Helen reached over and unplugged the phone from the wall. The red light on the answering machine went dark, and the house settled into a silence that felt like sanctuary. For the first time in decades, Helen Ramirez was unreachable, unavailable, unresponsive to other people's emergencies. She was simply present in her own life, in her own space, with her own thoughts and choices spreading out before her like an uncharted map. The freedom was terrifying and exhilarating in equal measure.
Chapter 6. An Unexpected Visitor. 3 days of blessed silence had passed when Helen heard the soft knock at her front door. Not the angry pounding that had announced Marissa's arrival, or the impatient doorbell ringing she had come to associate with crisis and demands. This was different, tentative, almost apologetic. Through the glass panel, Helen could see a woman about Sophia's age, with long black hair and a hesitant smile. It took her a moment to recognize Elena Vasquez, Sophia's closest friend from childhood. They had been inseparable from ages 8 to 18, spending countless hours in Helen's backyard, braiding each other's hair and practicing dance routines to pop songs that Helen had found too loud, but had never complained about. Helen hadn't seen Elena in nearly 5 years, not since she'd moved to Phoenix for a teaching job. She opened the door slowly, genuinely curious about what could have brought Sophia's old friend back to her small desert town. Mrs. Ramirez? Elena's voice was warm but careful, like someone approaching a skittish animal. I hope you don't mind me stopping by. I was in town visiting my parents, and Sophia asked me to come see you. Of course she had. Helen stepped aside to let Elena enter, noting how the young woman's eyes swept quickly over the living room, as if assessing the situation for signs of mental breakdown or physical illness, anything that might explain Helen's sudden transformation from reliable safety net to immovable object. Can I offer you some coffee? Helen asked, falling back on the hostess habits that had been drilled into her since childhood. Or iced tea? It's warm today. Coffee would be wonderful, thank you. They settled into the familiar ritual of hospitality, Helen bustling around the kitchen while Elena sat at the small dining table, commenting on how good the house looked, how the garden was thriving, how little Helen had changed over the years. The polite small talk of people who were trying to find their footing with each other. When Helen set down 2 steaming mugs and a plate of the oatmeal cookies she'd made yesterday, Elena's composure finally cracked slightly. Mrs. Ramirez, I have to be honest. I'm here because Sophia is...
Well, she's falling apart. Helen sipped her coffee and waited. She had learned in these past few days of silence that waiting often revealed more than asking questions. The wedding venue canceled their contract yesterday. When the final payment didn't come through, they gave Sophia's deposit to another couple and told her they were sorry, but business was business.
Helen felt a small pang, not guilt exactly, but something like recognition. She knew what it felt like to have carefully laid plans crumble due to circumstances beyond your control. But the feeling passed quickly, replaced by the steadier knowledge that Sophia's circumstances were entirely within her control. She could have invited her mother to the wedding. She could have treated Helen as more than a walking ATM. David's parents are furious, Elena went on, clearly struggling with how much to reveal. They've been questioning the engagement from the beginning. They think Sophia isn't good enough for their son, if I'm being blunt. And now this whole mess with the canceled venue and the missing money, they're talking about calling off the wedding entirely. Helen set down her coffee cup with deliberate care. And what does Sophia think about that? She's terrified. She loves David, Mrs. Ramirez. She really does. But his family has always made her feel like she has to prove herself worthy of him. She's been planning this wedding to show them that she comes from a good family, that she can handle their social expectations, and now she's learning that good families don't uninvite their mothers from weddings. Elena's face flushed. She knows she made a mistake. She knows the email was poorly worded. Poorly worded? Helen almost smiled at the euphemism. Is that what we're calling it? She was trying to manage a difficult situation. David's mother has very strong opinions about guest lists and social protocols. She made some comments about appropriate attendance for such a formal affair. Sophia panicked and thought if she could just keep everyone happy by making me disappear. Elena looked down at her hands. She's young, Mrs. Ramirez. She's never had to navigate these kinds of family politics before. She didn't know how to stand up to David's mother without creating a scene. But she knew how to uninvite her own mother without creating a scene. Interesting how that worked out. They sat in silence for several minutes. Elena seemed to be gathering courage for something, and Helen found herself almost curious about what approach Sophia's emissary would take next. She's willing to compromise, Elena said finally. She wants you at the wedding, really wants you there. She's looking at smaller venues now, places that are more family-friendly, less formal. She thinks maybe a garden party atmosphere, something more relaxed, where everyone can just enjoy themselves. Helen noticed the careful phrasing. More family-friendly meant cheaper. Less formal meant David's parents would be less likely to attend, removing the source of pressure that had caused Sophia to erase her mother in the first place. And she's hoping you might reconsider the financial contribution. Even half the amount would help so much. She's applied for loans, but with the short timeline... There it was, the real reason for this visit, wrapped in emotional appeals and delivered by someone Helen had once loved like a second daughter. Sophia was in financial freefall, and Helen's $40,000 remained her best hope of avoiding complete humiliation. Helen stood up and walked to the window, looking out at her small garden where tomatoes grew in defiant abundance despite the harsh desert conditions. She had planted those tomatoes herself, tended them herself, harvested them herself. No one had helped her, and no one had questioned her right to enjoy the fruits of her labor. Elena, she said without turning around, do you remember the summer you and Sophia were 16? You both wanted to go to that music camp in Colorado? Of course,
That was an amazing summer. It cost $3,000 per girl. I worked 4 jobs that summer to pay for both of you to go. 4 jobs, Elena. I cleaned offices at night, worked double shifts at the hospital, took in ironing, and sold my grandmother's jewelry to make sure you girls could have that experience. Helen turned to face Elena, whose eyes were wide with sudden understanding. I never told Sophia about the jewelry. I never wanted her to feel guilty about the sacrifices. I just wanted her to have opportunities, to see the world beyond this small town. And do you know what she said when she got home from camp? Elena shook her head. She said it was okay, but not as good as she had expected, that the food was mediocre and her roommate was annoying. She never thanked me, never asked how I'd managed to pay for it. It was just something that appeared in her life, like magic. The silence stretched between them, heavy with recognition. That's the pattern, Elena. I give, she takes, and somehow I'm always expected to be grateful for the opportunity to sacrifice more. Well, I'm 62 years old, and I'm tired of being invisible. Elena leaned forward in her chair. But this is different. This is her wedding. This is the most important day of her life. Is it? Because from where I sit, it looks like a very expensive performance designed to impress people who don't particularly like her. And I'm not funding performances anymore. Mrs. Ramirez, please. She's desperate. She's talking about eloping, about giving up on the whole thing. She's crying every day. Helen felt the familiar tug of maternal instinct, the automatic impulse to fix, to soothe, to make everything better. But underneath that impulse was something stronger now, the knowledge that some lessons could only be learned through natural consequences. Helen, there are some wounds that can't be repaired with money or apologies offered too late. Sophia made a choice when she decided I wasn't worth including in her special day. She chose to prioritize strangers' opinions over her own mother's feelings. That choice has consequences. Elena's eyes filled with tears. So that's it? You're just going to let her suffer? I'm going to let her grow up. At 30 years old, it's time she learned that treating people poorly has costs, that love isn't something you can take for granted forever. Elena finished her coffee in silence, clearly struggling with how to report this conversation back to Sophia. When she stood to leave, her movements were slow, defeated. She really does love you, you know? She's never learned how to show it properly. Helen looked at this young woman who had once been like family to her, who had eaten countless meals at her table and fallen asleep on her couch during sleepovers, and felt a deep sadness for all the ways people could love each other badly. I know she loves me, Elena, but love without respect, love without consideration, love that asks you to make yourself invisible, that's not enough anymore. I spent 40 years accepting scraps and calling it a feast. I won't do it anymore. After Elena left, Helen sat in her quiet living room as afternoon shadows lengthened across the floor. Somewhere in Santa Fe, Sophia was probably crying. Somewhere in Phoenix, Elena was probably calling to report that Helen remained unmoved. Somewhere in the world, other mothers were choosing between their dignity and their children's immediate happiness. Helen had made her choice, and for the first time in decades, she was choosing herself. The peace that settled over her wasn't the peace of resolution. There would be more calls, more visits, more pressure in the days to come. But it was the peace of knowing that she was finally standing on solid ground in her own truth, with her own worth firmly established in her own heart. No one could take that away from her now.
Chapter 7. The Collapse of the Wedding. The news came to Helen the way most news traveled in small towns, through Mrs. Chen's niece, who worked at the florist shop in Santa Fe and had heard it from the wedding planner, who had heard it from the caterer, who had been scrambled to find last-minute replacements for what was supposed to be the social event of the season. Helen was deadheading her roses when Mrs. Chen appeared at the garden fence, her weathered hands gripping the chain link as if she needed support for what she was about to share. "Helen, dear, I hope you don't mind me asking, but is everything all right with Sophia's wedding? My niece Maria mentioned some complications." Helen straightened up slowly, brushing dirt from her gardening gloves. In the 3 weeks since Elena's visit, she had heard nothing directly from Sophia or Marissa. The silence had been both blessing and burden. She was grateful for the peace, but the mother in her couldn't help wondering what chaos might be unfolding in her absence. "What kind of complications?" Helen asked, though part of her already knew. Mrs. Chen's expression was delicately neutral, the way neighbors learned to look when they were about to share information that might be painful. "Well, Maria said the wedding planner called her shop in a panic last Tuesday. Seems the original venue fell through, and they needed flowers for a much smaller ceremony. Emergency arrangements, she called it." Helen felt something twist in her stomach. Not guilt exactly, but the echo of 40 years of maternal worry. Where are they having it now? David's backyard, from what Maria heard, his parents' house in Albuquerque. Very small guest list, maybe 20 people. Mrs. Chen paused, her dark eyes kind but curious. She also mentioned that the bride seemed quite distressed. Helen nodded slowly, absorbing this information. The grand Santa Fe resort had been replaced by a backyard. The elegant ceremony Sophia had been planning for 2 years had collapsed into a handful of people gathered around someone else's patio. All the social posturing, all the attempts to impress David's family, had come to nothing. "When is it happening?" Helen heard herself ask. "This Saturday, day after tomorrow." Helen realized with a start that she had lost track of the original wedding date entirely. For months, May 15th had loomed in her calendar like a storm system, a date that required preparation and outfit selection and careful emotional management. Now it was almost upon them, and she felt nothing but a strange, hollow curiosity about how it would all unfold. "Are you—" She hesitated. "Are you planning to attend?" Helen looked down at her hands, still dirty from gardening, still capable of nurturing life from desert soil. "I wasn't invited to the backyard wedding either." The words came out matter-of-factly, without the sharp edge of pain she might have expected. Mrs. Chen's face softened with understanding, the look of one grandmother recognizing another's heartbreak. "Oh, Helen, I'm so sorry." "Don't be." Helen surprised herself with how steady her voice sounded. "I'm learning that some doors close so others can open." That evening, Helen found herself doing something she hadn't done in weeks. She turned her phone back on. The voicemail box was full, as she had expected, but most of the messages were old. Only 3 were recent. 2 from Marissa, sounding tired rather than angry, and 1 from a number she didn't recognize. The unknown caller turned out to be David, Sophia's fiancé. His voice was formal, uncomfortable, like someone fulfilling an unpleasant obligation. "Mrs. Ramirez, this is David Chen. Sorry, David Morrison. Sophia's, Well, we're getting married on Saturday, and she asked me to call. We're having a small ceremony at my parents' house. Sophia would like you to be there if you're willing to come. She's been having a hard time with everything, and I think she realizes she made some mistakes. Anyway, the ceremony is at 4 o'clock. I can text you the address if you want to come. Helen played the message twice, listening for something she couldn't quite name. An apology, perhaps, some acknowledgement of what had led them to this moment, but David's voice carried only obligation and exhaustion, the tone of someone who had been pushed into making a call he didn't want to make. She deleted the message without writing down his number. Saturday arrived with the kind of crystalline clarity that desert mornings sometimes brought. Air so clean it seemed to magnify colors and sounds, making everything appear more vivid and immediate. Helen woke early and made coffee, then sat in her kitchen reading the newspaper as she had every morning for the past month. At exactly 4 o'clock, as Sophia was presumably walking down some makeshift aisle in David's backyard, Helen was repotting a jade plant that had outgrown its container. The symbolism wasn't lost on her. Transplanting something that had been constrained, giving it room to grow, creating conditions for new life. Her phone buzzed once with a text message from an unknown number. "Mom, I wish you were here. I'm sorry for everything. S." Helen read the message 3 times, then set the phone aside and continued with her repotting. The jade plant's roots had grown thick and twisted, wound around themselves from being confined too long. She worked carefully to untangle them, to give each root space to extend into fresh soil. Sunday morning brought rain, the first substantial precipitation the desert had seen in months. Helen stood at her kitchen window, watching water run off her roof and pool in the small courtyard where she grew herbs. The roses would benefit from this unexpected blessing, as would the tomatoes and the small patch of wildflowers she had planted along the back fence. Her phone rang just after 10 o'clock, Marissa's number, but when she answered, she heard Sophia's voice, raw, exhausted, barely recognizable as the confident professional who had sent that first cold email weeks earlier. "Mom?" "Hello, Sophia. I got married yesterday." "I heard. Congratulations." A long pause, filled with the sound of Sophia trying not to cry. It wasn't what I planned. Nothing was what I planned." Helen waited, learning that silence could be more powerful than any response she might craft. "David's parents barely spoke to me. His mother wore black, Mom, black, to my wedding, like she was in mourning, and there were only 17 people there, including the photographer. It felt like a funeral more than a celebration." "I'm sorry to hear that." Are you? Are you really sorry, or are you glad that everything fell apart?" Helen considered the question seriously. Was she glad? Did some part of her take satisfaction in knowing that Sophia's attempt to build a perfect life without her mother had crumbled so spectacularly? "I'm sorry that you're hurting. I'm sorry that your wedding day was painful instead of joyful. But I'm not sorry that actions have consequences. I'm not sorry that you've learned something about what happens when you treat people as expendable." Sophia was crying openly now, the kind of unrestrained sobbing that reminded her of a much younger girl with scraped knees and broken toys. "I made a mistake, Mom. I made a
terrible mistake, and now everything is ruined." "Not everything," Helen said quietly. "You're married to someone you love. You have your health, your career, your whole life ahead of you. Those aren't small things." "But I lost you. I lost my mom because I was stupid and scared and tried to make everyone happy except the person who mattered most." Helen felt something loosen in her chest, some knot of pain she hadn't even realized she'd been carrying. This was what she had been waiting for. Not groveling or begging, but recognition, acknowledgement, understanding.
"You didn't lose me, Sophia. I'm still here, but I'm not the same person I was before. I'm not someone who will accept being treated as less than. I'm not someone who will fund my own erasure. I know, and I'm so sorry. I wish I could take it all back. I wish I could do everything differently. But you can't," Helen said, and her voice was gentle now, the voice of a mother teaching her child something essential. "We can't undo the past. We can only learn from it and choose differently going forward." Outside, the rain had stopped, and sunlight was beginning to break through the clouds, creating small rainbows in the water droplets that clung to her window. Helen watched the light shift and change, thinking about beginnings and endings, about the way painful experiences could sometimes clear the air like a desert storm. "Mom, would it be okay if I came to visit? Not to ask for anything, just to see you. To talk?" Helen looked around her quiet kitchen, at the jade plant sitting in its new pot on the windowsill, at the newspaper folded neatly on the counter, at the life she had been building for herself in these weeks of solitude and self-discovery. "Yes," she said, "you can visit. But Sophia, yes, come because you want to know how I'm doing, not because you need something from me. Come as my daughter who loves me, not as someone with problems for me to solve. I will. I promise I will." After they hung up, Helen sat in the growing brightness of her kitchen, feeling something she hadn't experienced in decades, the calm satisfaction of being exactly where she belonged, exactly who she was meant to be. The wedding was over. The drama had collapsed under its own weight, and Helen Ramirez, not Sophia's mother, not Marissa's mother, but simply Helen, was still standing, still growing, still blooming in the desert soil of her own chosen life.
Chapter 8. Reclaiming Myself. 2 months after the wedding that wasn't, Helen found herself standing in front of an easel for the first time in 43 years, holding a paintbrush like a woman greeting an old friend she'd almost forgotten she missed. The community center art class met every Tuesday evening in a room that smelled of turpentine and possibility. Helen had walked past the flyers advertising Watercolor Wednesdays and Beginning Oils for years, always with a small pang of longing, quickly followed by practical thoughts about grocery budgets and daughters who might need emergency funds. But on a Tuesday in July, with $40,000 still sitting in her bank account and no one's crisis demanding her immediate attention, Helen had surprised herself by walking through the community center doors and signing up for Painting Your Truth, Art for Life Transitions. The instructor was a woman named Carmen, probably in her 50s, with silver-streaked hair and paint-stained fingers that gestured expressively when she talked about color theory and emotional expression. She had greeted Helen's tentative explanation, "I used to paint a little years ago, before I got married," with the kind of warm understanding that suggested she'd heard similar stories many times before. "Art waits for us," Carmen had said simply. "It's always there when we're ready to come back."
Now, 8 weeks into the class, Helen's small dining room table had been transformed into a makeshift studio. Tubes of paint lay scattered across newspapers, brushes stood at attention in old mason jars, and canvases in various stages of completion leaned against the walls. The whole house smelled faintly of linseed oil and creative possibility. Her latest painting was a desert landscape, not the picture postcard version that tourists expected, but the real desert she saw from her kitchen window every morning. The subtle purples and oranges of sunrise over scrub brush, the way shadows fell between cacti arms, the fierce beauty of things that bloomed despite harsh conditions. Helen stepped back from the easel, considering the work. Her technique was rusty, certainly, and her hands weren't as steady as they'd been when she was 20, but there was something alive in the painting, something true that made her heart flutter with the same excitement she'd felt as a young art student before marriage and motherhood had redirected all her creative energy toward lunchboxes and Halloween costumes. The kitchen timer chimed, reminding her that she had dinner plans. Not the rushed, obligation-heavy dinners she'd grown accustomed to with her daughters, but genuine social time with Ruth Morrison, her old friend from nursing school who had recently moved back to town after her husband's death. They'd reconnected at the grocery store 3 weeks ago, recognizing each other despite the decades that had passed. Ruth had been buying ingredients for one, just as Helen had been, and they'd stood in the produce section catching up on 40 years of life, careers and children, divorces and deaths, all the ways their carefully planned young adult lives had evolved into something unrecognizable. "I keep cooking for 2 out of habit," Ruth had confessed, holding up a single sweet potato. "Then I remembered Tom's not coming home for dinner anymore, and I don't know whether to laugh or cry." "I keep not cooking at all," Helen had admitted. "For the first time in decades, no one needs me to show up with a casserole or a solution to their latest crisis. I'm learning what I actually like to eat when it's just for me." That conversation had led to dinner invitations, which had led to a standing Tuesday date at the little Mexican restaurant downtown, where they could order margaritas without anyone asking them to be responsible for anything more demanding than choosing between chicken and beef. Helen cleaned her brushes carefully and changed from her paint-splattered shirt into the turquoise blouse she'd bought last week, the first piece of clothing she purchased in 2 years that wasn't black or navy or designed to be invisible at family gatherings. The color brought out her eyes, the sales clerk had said, and Helen had realized with a start that she couldn't remember the last time someone had noticed her eyes. The restaurant was busy for a Tuesday, filled with families and couples and groups of friends sharing plates of enchiladas and conversations that sounded animated and joyful. Helen spotted Ruth at their usual table by the window, already working on a margarita and reading something on her phone that was making her laugh. "What's so funny?" Helen asked, sliding into the booth across from her friend. "My grandson just sent me a video of his attempts to make sourdough bread. Apparently, he's decided to become a baker, despite having 0 experience with yeast. It looks like a science experiment gone wrong, but he's so proud of it I could cry." Helen felt a familiar pang, not of jealousy exactly, but of recognition. Ruth's relationship with her family seemed so easy, so naturally affectionate. But then she remembered that Ruth had also struggled with her daughter for years over boundaries and expectations, had also learned the hard way that loving someone didn't mean losing yourself in service to their needs. They ordered their usual chicken enchiladas for Helen, chile rellenos for Ruth, extra salsa for both, and settled into the comfortable rhythm of conversation that had developed over these weeks of rekindling their friendship. "How's the painting going?" Ruth asked, squeezing lime into her second margarita. "Better than I expected. I'm remembering things I thought I'd forgotten, how colors interact, how light changes everything, and how satisfying it is to create something that exists just because I wanted it to exist, not because someone needed it from you." Helen paused with her fork halfway to her mouth, struck by the accuracy of Ruth's observation. Exactly. For 40 years, everything I made or did or gave had to have a practical purpose. A birthday cake for someone else's celebration, a quilt for someone else's wedding, a garden to feed someone else's family. This is different. This is for you. This is for me, Helen repeated, and the words felt revolutionary. Ruth leaned back in the booth, studying her friend with the kind of attention that came from genuine affection. You look different, lighter somehow, like you've been carrying heavy bags for years and finally set them down. Helen considered this. She did feel lighter, though she hadn't quite known how to name it. The constant low-level anxiety that had hummed in the background of her life for decades, the worry about whether the girls were okay, whether they had enough money, whether they needed something from her she hadn't anticipated, had quieted to almost nothing. I think I've learned something important, Helen said slowly, about the difference between being needed and being valued. Tell me. For so long, I thought being needed meant I mattered. If Sophia called me in crisis, if Marissa needed money, if there was always some emergency requiring my immediate attention, that felt like love, like importance. Helen paused to sip her margarita, gathering her thoughts. But being needed without being valued is just being used. And being constantly available for other people's emergencies meant I was never available for my own life. Ruth nodded knowingly. I went through something similar with my daughter after Tom died. She kept trying to manage my grief, to solve my loneliness by filling up all my time with activities and visits and plans. It took me months to realize that her helping was actually another kind of control. She needed me to need her, but she didn't particularly need to know what I actually wanted or how I was actually doing. What did you do? I started saying no. Not to everything, but to the things that felt like obligations rather than invitations. I stopped being available for every family crisis that wasn't actually a crisis. I started making my own plans and sticking to them, even when it disappointed people. She grinned. It was terrifying and wonderful. Helen thought about Sophia's tentative phone calls over the past weeks, still infrequent, but different in tone, less demanding, more curious. Sophia was learning to ask about Helen's life rather than simply updating her on the latest drama in Santa Fe. And when she did ask for advice or support, it came with acknowledgement, with gratitude, with respect for Helen's time and wisdom. I have a new rule, Helen said, surprising herself by voicing something she'd been thinking about but hadn't quite articulated. If my presence is conditional, if I'm only welcome when I'm useful, if my value depends on what I can't provide, then so is my effort. That's a good rule. It's a hard rule. 40 years of training doesn't disappear overnight. I still have moments where I want to rush in and fix everything, where I feel guilty for not being endlessly available. But then I remember how it felt to be uninvited from my own daughter's wedding, and the guilt passes. They finished their dinner as the sun set over the desert mountains, painting the sky in the same oranges and purples Helen had been trying to capture in her painting. Other diners came and went around them, but Helen felt no urgency to wrap up their conversation, no nagging sense that she should be somewhere else doing something more important for someone else. "What are you going to do with all of this freedom?" Ruth asked as they waited for the check. Helen considered the question. 6 months ago, she would have felt anxious about having too much unstructured time, too much space to fill. Now, the open calendar felt like a gift. "I'm thinking about traveling." Remember how we used to talk about seeing Europe when we were in nursing school? All those art museums and cathedrals and cafes where you could sit and watch the world go by? I remember. We were going to save up money and go together after graduation, before life happened instead. Before we let life happen to us instead of making choices about what we wanted our lives to be. Helen felt something spark in her chest, not the desperate excitement of escape, but the calmer satisfaction of possibility. My passport expired 15 years ago. I think I'm going to renew it. I think that's a wonderful idea. And, Helen? Yes? When you go, don't tell anyone you're leaving until you're already gone, just in case someone tries to convince you that their emergency is more important than your dream. They laughed together, the kind of laughter that comes from shared understanding and hard-won wisdom. Helen paid the check, not because Ruth expected her to, but because she wanted to, because generosity felt different when it came from choice rather than obligation. Walking to their cars in the warm evening air, Helen felt a deep contentment settle over her like a favorite blanket. Tomorrow, she would paint again, maybe work on the landscape or start something entirely new. This weekend, she would visit the bookstore and buy a travel guide to Italy. Next month, she would sign up for the intermediate painting class. For the first time in decades, Helen's future stretched ahead of her like an unmarked canvas, not empty, but full of potential, waiting for her to decide what she wanted to create. At home, she made herself a cup of tea and sat in her living room, looking around the space that had become truly hers. The quiet didn't feel empty anymore. It felt peaceful. The solitude didn't feel lonely. It felt chosen. Her phone buzzed with a text message from Sophia. "Thinking of you tonight. Hope you're well. Love you." Helen smiled and typed back, "Having dinner with a friend and planning some travel. Love you too." She didn't elaborate. She didn't feel compelled to provide a detailed account of her evening or her plans or her emotional state. Sophia's message felt like genuine care rather than the prelude to a request, and Helen's response felt like connection rather than obligation. This, she thought, was what love looked like when it included respect. Helen Ramirez turned off her phone and settled deeper in her chair, watching the last light fade from her windows. Tomorrow would bring new possibilities, new choices, new opportunities to choose herself over being endlessly needed. For the first time in decades, Helen was exactly where she belonged, in her own life, living for her own joy, blooming magnificently in the desert of her own making. The silence that surrounded her wasn't the absence of memories, it was the presence of peace. And Helen, at 62, was finally home.
Thank you for joining us on this remarkable journey. Until next time, remember, you are stronger than you know, braver than you believe, and more capable than you imagine. How did you find today's story? Please let us know in the comments where you are right now and what you're doing while listening to this. We're curious about your stories too. And if you enjoyed this story, please give us a like and subscribe to our channel. Thank you so much for listening today. Good night, and may you never underestimate the power of your own courage.